Good evening. I'm Cynthia Kittredge, the Dean and President of the Seminary of the Southwest, and on behalf of our whole community, I welcome you all to this opening evening of our observation of Black History Month. This is a really extraordinary series of events we have planned, some very, very challenging and difficult subjects, starting with our topic tonight. I'm grateful to all those who have planned this event and all those who are here from the community, and I'm going to ask Scott Bader-Say, our academic dean, to say more about that and to introduce our speaker, Asante Todd.
Thank you, Cynthia. Welcome, everyone. Very glad to see you here this evening. The first thing I'd like to do is to thank our Black History Month committee. This is a group of folks who have put a lot of work into making this a month of good, challenging conversation, a month of some good celebration, a month of good remembrance. And the committee was chaired by one of our senior students, Hunter Ruffin, who did an amazing amount of work for someone who is also a student. Hunter is over here, and I just want to acknowledge him because Hunter really took the lead on this and did a fantastic job. Other members of the committee included John Colmer, Linwood Randolph, Glennis Como Robinson, Leisha Brannon, Nadine McElroy, Ora Houston, Brittany James Laceda, Cynthia Kittredge, and myself. Thanks to all of you who did the good work of bringing the events of this month together. I also want to note that you may tweet about this evening's event, and we will be receiving tweets about this evening's event, including questions via tweet for the question and answer time. So if you want to tweet out at the hashtag MySSW, please feel free to do so. And then during question and answer time after Asante's talk, we will have some folks watching our feed and pulling out some of the questions from those who might be participating this evening through our live stream. Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, says this: during Black History Month, Americans congratulate themselves for having put an end to discrimination against African Americans in employment, housing, public benefits, and public accommodations. School children wonder out loud how discrimination could ever have been legal in this great land of ours. Rarely are they told that it is still legal. Many of the forms of discrimination that relegated African Americans to an inferior caste during Jim Crow continue to apply to huge segments of the black population today, provided they are first labeled felons. Well, it is our hope that we will be having a different kind of Black History Month conversation today. And we are fortunate to have with us Asante Todd, Assistant Professor of Christian Ethics at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, to help us make that happen. Some of you may know Asante. He filled in for me here at Southwest when I was on sabbatical in 2012, so some of the seniors may remember having taken a class with Asante. Asante holds degrees from the University of Texas here in Austin and Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He is currently a doctoral candidate in the Graduate Department of Religion at Vanderbilt and is, this close to completing your dissertation? Right, that close. He is that close. Asante's main focus is political theology, looking at the intersection of African American cultural studies, theological ethics, and political theory. Prior to his doctoral studies, Asante worked with the Texas State Legislature and the Austin Area Urban League. He also served as a youth minister at St. James Missionary Baptist Church here in Austin. Asante is a rising scholar in the field of Christian ethics. He is a friend, and it is an honor to have him speak with us today. Thank you, Asante, for being with us.
Thank you, Scott, for that great introduction. It's good to see you again. Scott and I had the opportunity to meet and have lunch a few weeks ago and talked about how excited we were about this opportunity. So I'd like to thank all of you once again for inviting me out. I'd like to thank Dr. Kittredge, of course, who I've also not seen in a while. It's good to see you as well. And I'm seeing you in the capacity of president at this time before you are dean. So glad to hear that news. Also want to thank Hunter Ruffin for putting on this event. I know that it took a lot of hard work, and most of it you did not get class credit for. So we appreciate all the things you've done. Also want to thank the seminary at large, Seminary of the Southwest. I think it's a great thing that you all are talking about such a difficult issue during this month. I encourage you to continue to have these difficult conversations, because I think these are where seminaries' growing edges are these days. I also want to thank, and I want to make sure I get this right, the Multicultural Student Task Force that helped put this on. Am I getting the name of that correct? Diversity Task Force. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I'd also want to thank all of these individuals who have worked so hard to make tonight's event happen. I'm excited about the opportunity to speak with you today on a topic that is not only personal interest for myself, but one that I believe, and I think many would agree, is a topic that occupies a central place in the national consciousness as well. Mass incarceration not only poses significant challenges for African Americans, but also serves as a litmus test for the nature of American culture and politics itself. Tonight's lecture, which I have entitled "The Cruel Hand, the Birdcage, and the Fire This Time," I'll say that again: the cruel hand, the birdcage, and the fire this time, takes as its point of departure one of the most well-written texts on the issue of mass incarceration. That's a text you have before you all tonight, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Each phrase in the title of my lecture is actually drawn from Alexander's book itself. The Cruel Hand is the title of her fourth chapter. The birdcage is a metaphor lifted from the 5th chapter, and the fire this time is the title of her 6th chapter. Today I want to contribute to transformative conversations, not only here on the seminary campus, but beyond that, if possible, on mass incarceration by reflecting on these 3 themes. Themes which all, to me as a theologian, find a path of entry into public conversation on the topic through particular theological conversations which we'll get to. I first want to recognize Alexander's main argument before we begin further reflection. Her basic claim is that the American criminal justice system is not a fair system of crime and punishment, but is actually a racialized system of social control. It is not just another institution affected with racial bias. Again, Alexander wants to argue that it is a comprehensive system of racialized social control, whose ultimate objective is to deny citizenship to African Americans. As a result of mass incarceration strategies by the U.S., largely executed, of course, by an unchecked police force, African Americans now find themselves subjected to the social forces of what Alexander dubs the new Jim Crow. There are differences, she notes, between this new Jim Crow and the old Jim Crow, which took place from roughly 1890 to 1965. A few of these differences are that the degree of racial hostility present during Jim Crow has to some extent weakened in our own day. Alexander also wants to point out that whites, to a certain degree, have also been affected, been victims of the war on drugs and the phenomenon of mass incarceration. And ironically, some blacks support the get tough on crime policies of the war on drugs. However, as was the case with the old Jim Crow, the new is also marked by things like legalized discrimination, political disenfranchisement, and racial segregation. Today, African Americans comprise roughly 40% of the U.S. prison population, although we make up only 13%, roughly 12 to 13% of the larger U.S. population. And in turn, the U.S. prison system incarcerates a greater portion of its population than any other modern country on earth, one out of approximately 100 adults, every 100 adults. Alexander's text then raises concerns not only for African Americans, as I've said, but also for both American society at large and for Christians throughout the world. In demonstrating her claim, Alexander lifts up three themes that I want to trace. The first, as I mentioned, is the cruel hand. The use of the term, the cruel hand, by Alexander draws upon the thinking of the 19th century activist and author Frederick Douglass, who in a speech in the 1853 National Colored Convention lamented the condition that befell African Americans as a result of slavery and racism. Says Douglass, quote, "A heavy and cruel hand has been laid upon us. As a people, we feel ourselves not to be only deeply injured, but grossly misunderstood as well. Our white countrymen do not know us. They are strangers to our character, ignorant of our capacity, oblivious to our history and our progress. The great mass of American citizens estimates us as being characterless, purposeless people. And hence, we hold our heads up. We hold our heads up against the withering influence of the nation's scorn and contempt." End quote. In keeping with Douglass's 19th century report, which lamented the ills of black society, Michelle Alexander offers a 21st century version that highlights similar effects with respect to mass incarceration and racism. For example, once released from the confines of prison, Alexander notes in her 4th chapter, The Cruel Hand, that freedmen must then match their wits as well as their will against a heavy and cruel hand that would seek to push them back into prison. When freed, criminals have the same or fewer rights as a freed slave during the old Jim Crow. The prison label represents civic death, according to Michelle Alexander. She also calls this the Mark of Cain. It implies permanent second-class status. Former prisoners are placed in an impossible situation, really. They are essentially barred from access to public housing, often cannot find work, often lose their children. All of these effects, of course, compounded on top of one another. The situation is difficult enough, but in addition to these, they are forced to pay ridiculous fines. Sometimes, for example, they're billed for drug testing or drug treatment that was supposed to be available to them as part of the rehab program. Many are forced to pay book-in fees whenever they enter jail, or jail per diems to cover the cost of detention while they are in jail. Many are required to pay public defender application fees, right? If you want a public defender, you must first apply and submit a fee in order to get one in certain states. Also among these fees, post-conviction fees, pre-sentence report fees, parole fees, probation fees, and the list goes on. One thing becomes incredibly clear in this chapter, that is that the U.S. is determined to make its crime pay, and they have sent a heavy and cruel hand to collect the debt. In the end, the cruel hand of American criminal justice silences, shames, exiles, indebts, isolates, and eventually turns distrustful a great number of African Americans. Perhaps the most curious aspect of this chapter, the cruel hand, is that although Alexander combines her discussion of this notion of a heavy and cruel hand with talk of African Americans' exclusion from the U.S. economy in many ways, Alexander does not make the connection that I wanted her to make. That is, making the connection from the cruel hand and African American exclusion from the U.S. economy to perhaps one of the most famous hand metaphors that we know, namely the invisible hand in political economic discourse, whose emergence can be traced to the thought of political economist Adam Smith in the 18th century. The Scottish philosopher who has become known as one of the fathers of political economy appeals to this idea of the invisible hand at least 2 times in his writings. The second is in his The Wealth of Nations, during a commentary on free trade and open markets. And before this, it is in his The Theory of Moral Sentiments, during an argument against government or state-controlled distributive policies. I want to highlight Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand because it allows us to do something that I want to, that Alexander was not doing in her text, which is to isolate the rationality or the general way of thinking that serves to legitimate mass incarceration. Said another way, the notion of the invisible hand, along with its individualistic understanding of the human being, which we'll see, provides a particular kind of way of thinking, a particular kind of rationality that makes mass incarceration make sense. Behind Douglas and Alexander's cruel hand, then, is the invisible hand of Adam Smith. And behind the invisible hand, there is a particular view of human nature that we have to think about for just a second. Although there may indeed be connections between Adam Smith's discussion of free trade and mass incarceration, I want to bracket this question. In other words, I want to bracket what Adam Smith is talking about in his The Wealth of Nations. And I want to focus on what Adam Smith talks about in his The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Smith's question of the invisible hand in relation to government-controlled distributions in his theory is perhaps more relevant to our conversation. He begins with the idea that the political economy is what he calls a system of private want satisfaction made up of independent private agents. We're going to break that down right here in a second. Each of these agents, motivated, of course, by their own self-interest, according to Adam Smith, proceeds to buy and sell on the market in order to satisfy their own desires, wishes, or wants. We might take an example many of you know all too well, that of buying student textbooks to get at what Adam Smith wants to get at. In the eyes of Adam Smith, one's desire for a book, a student's desire perhaps, leads them to purchase this book, say on Amazon. And in turn, there is also a seller on Amazon who desires to sell the book that you desire to purchase. Although these desires Smith would call primarily self-interested, he argues that these desires are actually the driving force behind the perpetual workings of the economy. The economy continues to churn as each individual pursues their own interests, whether it be purchasing books or other items. In such a system, Adam Smith asks a question: how should one go about determining and defining what we mean when we say social justice? According to Smith, social justice simply cannot be produced by the state. This would be a violation of the natural liberty that individuals are afforded as they exchange on the free market. Smith also argues against state redistributive measures for a second reason, namely because resources are better distributed by what he calls the invisible hand. The invisible hand, specifically of providence, according to Smith, which distributes resources through, he doesn't use this language, but we've heard this language, distributes resources through a trickle-down effect. For example, after I go onto Amazon to buy a book, and after one goes on to Amazon to sell it, others will be indirect beneficiaries of the transaction. A friend, for example, will borrow the book, perhaps read it, and receive a benefit from it. As for the seller, the realization of his desires trickles down perhaps to the next cab driver he might hail. With the money made from the book sale, he is able to give the cab driver a nice tip. For Smith, these kinds of trickling downs are the best that we can really do as far as social justice is concerned. Any appeals to the humanity and justice of people for the redistribution of social goods will fall on flat ears. The best we can do is trust that redistribution will occur according to the providential plan, in spite of the luxury and the caprice of individuals on the market. For all of the changes in the discourse of economics since the time of Adam Smith, his argument, first of all, about individuals, and secondly, about the invisible hand, have remained a mainstay in economic thinking. Contemporary economic theory, which you may know as Neoclassical Economics, also holds that social welfare or social justice can only ever be defined as the logical byproduct of the collective aggregate of voluntary market exchanges. In other words, in order to achieve social good or collective good, what we need to do is achieve the aggregate of individual satisfaction. The maximization of individual satisfaction, as well as the maximization of social welfare, are interconnected for Smith. Both rise and fall with one another. As with Smith, the neoclassical theory argues that the market should be trusted to realize what we mean when we say social justice, so that all are provided with the necessaries of life in a manner that is more effective than attempts to implement social justice policies through the state. In other words, the market, rather than the state, for Smith, achieves what we mean when we say social justice, redistribution. In effect, the same scenario of the bookseller, the book buyer, and the indirect beneficiaries would play out in roughly the same way under the neoclassical model as it would in the older Smithian model. Again, I raise the topic of the invisible hand in relation to Michelle Alexander's chapter on the cruel hand to make a point that the dynamics of the cruel hand which she highlights, discrimination, segregation, disenfranchisement, and the like, are legitimated, are made tolerable, or explained away by the idea of the invisible hand and the individual on the market achieving want satisfaction. Let me explain. In other words, many who would look at the case of mass incarceration might say the following: I just don't get it. Even the most depraved person can make a living if they simply do what they're supposed to do on the market, buy and sell. And if some cannot fulfill their desires or their dreams by way of the market, then maybe it is the case that they deserve to be, at the very worst, in prison, at the very least, on the sidelines of society. There is no other avenue to social justice other than the natural forces of the market. There have been several criticisms of this way of thinking. For one, many have questioned whether such things as public choice or social choice can exist, given that the collective good is comprised of individual preferences. Another problem with the Smithian way of thinking, or the neoclassical way of thinking, enters when one considers that sometimes individual preference ordering isn't that consistent. Our desires change from moment to moment, and if one were to try to order them in a particular way, they would be inconsistent. Perhaps, however, the most effective criticism of neoclassical rationality is the idea of something that economists call externalities. If the economy is constituted by the pursuit of individual satisfaction, externalities are those social consequences, those social effects of consumption on others who had no part in the original voluntary transaction. Those set of effects of transactions on persons not party to the original transaction. We might return to the previous example of the bookseller and book buyer to help us get a clearer picture here. If there are buyers and sellers, it might be the case that over time, the book buyer has read all of his books and now needs a place to discard them. Finding, as one does, that no one really wants old books, he dumps them on the side of the road. In doing this, however, the buyer affects a third party, one who had nothing to do with the original transaction, and visits upon them, this third party, a set of circumstances which they did not choose. In other words, the idea of the invisible hand often fails to take account of circumstances where people are forced either to benefit or to pay from certain states of affairs that they had no part in bringing about. Left to its own devices, then, scholars argue that the market is incapable of imposing the cost of externality, of these social consequences, on particular individuals. The implications of this are crucial, for the idea of a set of activities in which economic agents engage each other involuntarily opens the door to politics in the sense of state action. What does all this mean for mass incarceration? It means this: first, that the economic rationality which helps mass incarceration make sense, the idea of the invisible hand and the idea of individuals pursuing their own desires on the market, simply cannot be used to refute Alexander's argument. Second, it means that politics, rather than economics, comes to play a central role with respect to the phenomenon of mass incarceration. In other words, mass incarceration cannot be explained away with some kind of individual choice theory. We cannot say that the victims of mass incarceration simply chose not to pursue their wants, desires, or wishes on the market. Instead, we have to begin to look at political factors instead of economic as to the causes of mass incarceration. Thus far, I've investigated Alexander's idea of the cruel hand. I talked about how underneath this, there's another idea of the invisible hand, and how this idea oftentimes legitimates mass incarceration. Mass incarceration, then, is often overlooked to the extent that it is considered a natural outgrowth or effect of the market. We also concluded that economic reasoning falls short in explaining Alexander's argument about mass incarceration, and that it might actually be helpful to move to the arena of politics, if for no other reason than the problem of externalities, as I mentioned earlier. Now that we've looked at the economic rationality that is so prevalent in American society with respect to arguing against mass incarceration, I now want to move to look at a political metaphor that Alexander highlights in our text called the birdcage. So we're moving from the cruel hand to the birdcage. This, of course, is what Michelle Alexander does in the following chapter entitled The New Jim Crow. This is our 5th chapter. She wants to show us in this chapter how criminal justice system actually works. She notes this as a 3-step process: roundup, conviction, period of invisible punishment after release. And she also points out the similarities and differences of the new system of mass incarceration in comparison to the old Jim Crow. However, in this chapter, she also lifts up or appeals to the metaphor of the birdcage to get at a symbol that she feels will represent the plight of African Americans with respect to mass incarceration. Allow me to quote Alexander at length. If one thinks about racism by examining only one wire of a birdcage, or one form of disadvantage, it is difficult to understand how and why the bird is trapped. Only a large number of wires arranged in a specific way and connected to one another serve to enclose the bird and ensure that it does not escape. Again, Alexander says, one way of understanding our current system of mass incarceration is to think of it as a birdcage with a locked door. It is a set of structural arrangements that locks a racially distinct group into a subordinate political, social, and economic position, effectively creating a second-class citizenship. Those trapped within the system are not merely disadvantaged in the sense that they are competing on an unequal playing field or face additional hurdles to political or economic success. No, rather the system itself is structured to lock them in to a subordinate position, end quote. For Alexander, the birdcage metaphor is perhaps one of the most appropriate ways of describing how African Americans have been trapped within this complex of laws and police surveillance. Although I find Alexander's metaphor of the birdcage helpful for depicting the plight, I'm also inclined to draw on a different metaphor offered by a political thinker by the name of Giorgio Agamben. Agamben writes a book entitled Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life. In this book, Agamben wants to argue that instead of a birdcage, we might want to imagine the state of mass incarceration as synonymous or relevant to the metaphor of the camp. Camp as in concentration camp and or military camp. Agamben wants to argue that the camp, rather than the birdcage, is the hidden model or the paradigm of the political space of modernity itself. He argues that since the late 19th century, roughly around 1865, that a number of Western nations, most notably Germany, as we saw in the early 20th century, and America currently, have used the camp as their go-to political response in times of emergency. When faced with certain internal problems, especially an alleged enemy population, the government is faced with the decision on whether or not to suspend constitutional rights and liberties with respect to said population for the health and preservation of the state. If the U.S. government should decide to do so, this strategy implies the suspension of the court's privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, right? The writ which brings the convicted party into court. It also means the loss of due process for the population, as well as the extension of military authorities' wartime powers into the civil sphere, which would do a great deal to explain a lot of the militarization that we have seen with respect to police enforcement, law enforcement. These modifications enable the state to take a population literally outside of the established normative legal order and into what Agamben calls the camp. The idea of the camp brings along with it a particular conception of human beings, namely that of the non-citizen, the simple body without the protection of habeas corpus. Thus, in the camp, it is well known now that persons may be subjected to various forms of banishment or detention or even death. Agamben's metaphor of the camp, I think, is illuminating in very helpful ways, many of which the birdcage metaphor falls short. First, it helps us to illuminate the odd anti-democratic politics that have emerged and increased in intensity against African Americans beginning in the 1970s. It also helps to explain why we currently sit at an incarceration rate of roughly 2.2 million persons. The metaphor does much to explain how the U.S. government has justified its national crime strategy, which, according to the actual 1967 government document, labeled young black boys and girls naturally and intrinsically delinquent, and thus represented them as members of an enemy population that must be detained or even annihilated. The metaphor explains why the three phases of mass incarceration to date have been increasingly harsh in their penalties, why from the 1970s to the 1980s imprisonment risk increased so that those convicted of crimes were more likely to be sent to prison than ever before. It helps to explain why from the mid-1980s to the 1990s, this increasing likelihood of imprisonment shifted from all offenders to drug offenders specifically. And it also helps to explain why from the 1990s into even our contemporary situation, that truth in sentencing legislation has been introduced, which requires offenders to serve roughly 85% of their sentences before qualifying for parole. The metaphor also goes a long way in explaining why the American criminal justice system has all but closed its doors to cases involving racism and harshened its attitude towards African Americans. Why the justice system is trying fewer cases and pleading out more and more, and ultimately why blacks and Latinos do not receive equal protection under the law. The camp even hits a little bit closer to home here in Texas, and perhaps helps to explain why attorneys now have the power to try juveniles as adults and to introduce illegally obtained evidence into certain cases. And why, since 1982, the criminal justice system here in Texas has responded to its prison overcrowding issue with a build more prisons policy. A policy that culminated under George Bush, with an effort that saw 1 prison per week built during Bush's first year in office. And finally, the metaphor of the camp explains why so many black lives seem not to matter to U.S. police force, and why police policy remains unquestioned even in the wake of the deaths of certain African Americans, even within this past year, including the chokehold death of Eric Garner, the unarmed shooting of Michael Brown, and even explains why Trayvon Martin was not allowed to wear a hoodie or have a bag of Skittles candy without being shot. In other words, the camp metaphor, rather than the birdcage metaphor, does so much more work to get at the political dynamics that are currently going on with respect to mass incarceration. Thus far, then, I've looked at 2 themes. First, the cruel hand, then the birdcage. With the first, we saw that underneath the cruel hand was Adam Smith's invisible hand, and we saw how this idea of the invisible hand, as well as the idea of individuals as self-interested agents on the market, broke down in light of this idea of involuntary transactions. The breakdown of this idea forced us to move our thinking with respect to mass incarceration from economics to politics. And in the second part, we took up politics in terms of the different kinds of metaphors that might be used to frame and depict our political space. Instead of the metaphor of the birdcage, which does illuminate some problems, I suggested the metaphor of the camp to frame the contemporary political situation of many African Americans. In this third section, I want to turn from economics and politics to the issue of race. For here is where we find that Alexander ends her own text on the issue of race. And here perhaps is where theology might find its most substantive entry point, although the other 2 entry points, economics and politics, are not foreign to theology. The topic emerges, topic of race that is, yet again from Alexander's text, this time from her final chapter entitled "The Fire This Time." And so we might use that phrase, "the fire this time," to get at this problem of race. In her final chapter, Alexander concludes by calling for a new civil rights movement. According to her, the problem with the civil rights movement of the previous era was that it was eventually transitioned or shifted from a grassroots and moral movement to a professionalized legal service. In order for a new civil rights movement to emerge, however, Alexander knows that we must first confront and deal with our problem of racism. We need to resist the temptation, she says, to colorblind advocacy. And instead, we need to fight for racial justice and equality. Alexander urges us to, in her words, give back the racial bribe. Give back the idea of indifference and colorblindness. For according to Alexander, indifference and blindness, far more than outright hostility, form the sturdy foundation for all racial caste systems. Although the idea of races as a species has been long disproved by science, The title of Alexander's last chapter shows us that the problem of racism is not easily solved. Of course, several others before Alexander have learned this, most readily the mid-20th century American essayist, novelist, and author, from whose text Alexander draws the title of her last chapter. Before The Fire Next Time was the title of Alexander's chapter, this was the title of a book by American essayist and novelist James Baldwin, specifically his 1963 book called The Fire Next Time. Baldwin's book was divided into two short essays, and it is a treatise on race and religion in America. In the book, Baldwin, like Michelle Alexander some 50 years later, reflects on the difficulty of bridging the racial divide in America. And one will find many insightful comments on the topic in this volume. However, I think it might be more appropriate to conclude with a story from Baldwin rather than one of his direct insights, for it allows us to take up this issue, I think, in a particular manner, which we might be even able to carry into our conversations after this. It is a story that emerges from Baldwin's visit during the 1960s to the house of Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad himself, one of the most eminent leaders of the Nation of Islam from 1934 to 1975. Elijah Muhammad has called James Baldwin to his house to see what Baldwin is all about. Baldwin had a successful career, and he had drawn the attention of Elijah Muhammad. And now Baldwin approaches Elijah Muhammad's house, and the following occurs. "I do not know what I had expected to see," says Baldwin. "I had read some of his speeches, and I had heard fragments of others on the radio and on television, so I associated him with ferocity. But no, the man who came into the room was small and slender, really very delicately put together, with a thin face, large warm eyes, and a most winning smile. Something came into the room with him. His disciples' joy at seeing him, his joy at seeing them. It was the kind of encounter one watches with a smile simply because it's so rare that people enjoy one another. He teased the women like a father, with no hint of that ugly and unctuous flirtatiousness I knew so well from other churches. And they responded like that, with great freedom, and yet from a great and loving distance. He had seen me when he came into the room. I knew, though he had not looked my way. I had the feeling that as he talked and laughed with the others, whom I could only think of as his children, that he was sizing me up, deciding something. Now he turned toward me to welcome me with that marvelous smile and carry me back nearly 24 years ago. I was drawn toward his peculiar authority, how his smile promised to take the burden of my life off my shoulders. The central quality in Elijah's face is pain, and his smile is a witness to it, pain so old and deep and black that it becomes personal and particular only when he smiles. One wonders what he would sound like if he could sing. He turned to me with that smile and said something like, "I've got a lot to say to you, but we'll wait until we sit down." And I laughed. He made me think of my father and me as we might have been if we had been friends. In the dining room, there were two long tables. The men sat at one and the women sat at the other. Elijah was at the head of the table and I was seated at his left. I can scarcely remember what we ate, except that it was plentiful, sane, and simple. So sane and simple that it made me feel extremely decadent, and I think that I drank, therefore, 2 glasses of milk. Elijah mentioned having seen me on television and said that it seemed to him that I was not yet brainwashed and was trying to become myself. He said this in a curiously unnerving way, his eyes looking into mine and one hand half hiding his lips, as though he were trying to conceal bad teeth. But his teeth were not bad. Then I remembered hearing that he had spent some time in prison. I suppose that I would like to become myself, whatever that may mean, but I knew Elijah's meaning and mine were not the same. I said yes, I was trying to be me, but I did not know how to say more than that, so I waited. Whenever Elijah spoke, a kind of chorus arose from the table. Yes, that's right. This began to set my teeth on edge, and Elijah himself had a further unnerving habit, which was to ricochet his questions and comments off someone else on their way to you. Now, turning to the man on his right, he began to speak of what was on the TV. What had the people on TV made me feel? I could not answer this and was not absolutely certain that I was expected to. The people referred to had certainly made me feel exasperated and useless, but I did not think of them as my enemies. Elijah went on in his endless chorus of yes, that's right. Someone at the table joined in with him, yes, again. I looked around. It was a very young man who had said this scarcely more than a boy, very dark and sober, very bitter. Elijah began to speak of the Christian religion, of Christians, in the same soft, joking way. And as he began to engage in more conversation, he eventually turned his attention back to me. I do not know what Elijah asked me, but I caught enough of the question to try and give a response. I sat for a minute. I said at last, in answer to some of these other ricocheted questions, I left the church 20 years ago, and I haven't joined anything since. It was my way of saying that I didn't intend to join their movement either. And what are you now? Asked Elijah. I was in something of a bind, for I really could not say, could not allow myself to be stampeded into saying that I was a Christian. I? Now? Nothing. This was not enough. I'm a writer. I like doing things alone. I heard myself saying this. Elijah smiled at me. I don't, anyway, I said. Finally, think about it a great deal. Elijah said to his right, I think he ought to think about it all the deal. And with this, the table agreed. But there was nothing malicious or condemnatory in it. I had the stifling feeling that they knew I belonged to them, but I knew that I did not know it yet, that I remained unready, and that they were simply waiting patiently and with assurance for me to discover the truth for myself. I read to you at length this story from James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time to get at the question that Elijah Muhammad lifted up to James Baldwin. James Baldwin was meeting with Elijah Muhammad on issues of race, and Baldwin expected to be confronted with a very particular stereotype or caricature of Elijah Muhammad. But instead, Elijah Muhammad provided the opportunity for Baldwin to engage in a mode of self-reflection. And Elijah Muhammad asked Baldwin a piercing question, one that I think is not lost on our ears today as we think about mass incarceration, economics, politics, and race. Namely, the question is, what are you now? What are you now? In his text, Baldwin lifts up the ultimate irony, because for most of his text, Baldwin has been arguing that white Americans, and to a certain degree, black Americans, are in somewhat of an identity crisis when it comes to this issue of race. Baldwin surmises that perhaps one of the fundamental problems is that people do not know who they are. I wonder if the question that Elijah Muhammad submitted to Baldwin might not have traction and meaning for us today. What are we now as a Christian church? What are we now as an American society? What are we now even as a seminary campus in light of the dynamics of mass incarceration? What are we even as incarceration numbers continue to rise? What are we as police forces continue to go unchecked? What are we as the well-being of our neighbors is compromised? Like Elijah Muhammad asked Baldwin, I don't ask this question maliciously or condemnatory, but I ask it with a little bit less patience than perhaps Muhammad had that day. And I ask it trusting that you all have the answer, that you all know exactly who you are, and that in the face of these kinds of challenges, that you know exactly how to behave. Quite simply, it is to stand in solidarity with and to love your neighbor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asante. Would you hang out here a second and field a few questions? Sure. All right. And do you want to field those yourself, or I can? All right. So we've got, maybe stay up with the mic. So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes. Let's pose some questions, and then that will serve as a preface to bring us back to our table conversation. So I'll let you work the crowd here. Don't forget, Hunter is going to be watching our Twitter feed, so periodically look over there, and there'll be some questions as well.
Okay. You have questions already?
This isn't from the Twitter feed. This is just from me. I got into a debate with a friend of mine about the Twitter campaign "Use Me Instead." I don't know if you're familiar with it, but across the country, in response to a lot of the violence coming out of police departments being inflicted, in particular on people of color, predominantly white clergy would tweet a selfie to a particular police department with the hashtag #UseMeAsInstead. And my question is that helpful? Or is that simply recentering the issue back on white people instead of actually standing behind our African American system?
That's a great question. Thank you. I would say it's definitely helpful to the extent that it is an act of solidarity. In one of James Cone's, for those who don't know James Cone, he's the founder of Black Theology, teaches at Union Theological Seminary. In one of his books, James Cone says that he's not a categorical racist, right? He doesn't categorically hate people of other colors, especially white people. He's more upset about the fact that many whites don't, this is his words, don't stick out their neck for him. And so I think Cone's litmus test applies in this case. I think that is definitely helpful for our white brothers and sisters to speak with other whites about the ways in which these dynamics are problematic. And I definitely think that whites have voices and avenues and access that many African Americans do not with respect to particular demographics. Having said that, I do also want to say that it is never helpful if an unchecked police force is brutalizing anyone, right? So although I understand and appreciate the act of solidarity, what I would probably like to see happen after that is maybe a interracial or multicultural, jointly cultural movement where people of all races stand against a police force that seems to have overrun its bounds of respect to the Constitution. In the end, that will be the ideal solution, right? Nobody has to get brutalized, right? Hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I'm sorry, the last small comment you said, charter schools? Yeah. Yeah, so I'll have to say, first of all, that education policy is not my area of expertise. And so the things I say may be a little bit off, but I will say that there is a noticeable disciplinary discrepancy between white children and black children, and sometimes white children and Hispanic children. So that it turns out that the disciplinary measures given to black children and Latino children in schools turn out to be the first elements in what's called the school to prison pipeline, right? You're disciplined as a student, you find yourself in detention, probation, eventually you are in permanent detention, right? Which is what prison is essentially. So you're right to point out the ways in which these measures not only operate at the level of police, jail, courts, that kind of thing, but also, not to be funny, trickle down to the elementary levels, right? So that young black boys and girls are already understood to be criminal in behavior that, if we look at another child, we call it having a bad day, or Johnny's sick today or something like that, right? So there is a discrepancy. That's probably the best I can do to speak to that, but I hope that's helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Charlie, for really exciting perspective. What we got from the book was fairly disturbing journalistic account.
Yeah. That's right, yeah.
One of the things that I made comment, she goes to great lengths to talk about the Reconstruction era, the Jim Crow era, the effort that is made to distinguish poor blacks and poor blacks.
Mm.
So, and turn race against in your analysis, which is really moving society,
Thank you.
And you're starting from Smith and saying, okay, let's look at individual agencies,
Yeah.
and the necessity of exclusion camp.
That's right.
Almost, so how can you explain that? How can you explain politics of the camp? Anyone, as long as somebody. So how can you explain the effort that this nation seems to put on to make sure we can support black people, to make sure that the poor white people are
that's a complex question. It's going to be tough for me to answer that with respect to the Jim Crow era. My research hasn't gone back that far just yet. I can tell you the way it's worked in mass incarceration era from 1967 onwards. So, in 1967, the federal government issued, let me get my language correctly, the President's Commission on Criminal Justice and something or another. I can't remember the name of it. Under LBJ, I believe, issued a report, and the title of the report was called "The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society." Right? Already in that title, you have allusions to the market and to the either the classical or the neoclassical model, right? Here you have what is called a free society, and by that you should read a society of free exchange, individual want satisfaction. But you've got a challenge, right? We've got a challenge if we want to have the free society where everyone can essentially achieve satisfaction, and that is the challenge of crime. And if you go through the report, crime is not identified as particular actions or behaviors or even social features, but crime is identified, or it is strongly suggested that criminality is sort of a biological aspect of especially urban black boys in the city, right? That knowledge, right? The knowledge of a population as inherently and intrinsically delinquent is what legitimates all of these policies, right? Because if you have a population that is intrinsically delinquent, it will be the case that no matter what you do, no matter how much you put them on the market, right, according to this thinking, they will never be able to participate in our free society. So what do we have to do to criminals? We have to put them outside of our society. That means that we can sort of bracket and suspend constitutional rights and liberties with respect to this population, right? That's maybe a beginning, first brush way of getting at what you wanted me to explain, right? So economics and politics are not disconnected, although economic theory wants us to believe it is, right? Underneath this economic logic, there is an underside, there is a mirror, right? There is an if-then, right? If you're not this, you must be this. And you see this logic not only in Adam Smith, you see this in a lot of early modern political thinkers, right? John Locke, right? Everyone who can order themselves, their actions according to the demands of natural law, can participate in the formation of political society, but those people who can't have given themselves over to slavery. Right? This is what John Locke says. This is what all these thinkers say, right? That's a representation of a particular kind of person, right? The kind of person who, for whatever reason, cannot seem to get it together enough to engage in this voluntary exchange on the market, right? That's maybe a beginning way of getting at what you're asking. Was that helpful? Do you have a follow-up, maybe? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Scott.
So, Asante, one of the things I found most compelling about this book is that Alexander challenges two things that those of us who care about these issues think are good. He challenges colorblindness, and she challenges affirmative action.
Yeah.
Many of us who engage with these issues think that the goal is to be colorblind, right? Not the color of the skin, but the content of the character. She pushes back on that, and then she pushes back on affirmative action, especially in that last chapter. So two of the places where we think, right-thinking people are moving, and I have to say fairly persuasively, she comes at those and says, these are both probably bad ideas. So I'm interested in your response to that, because it felt to me like those were some of the most interesting moments.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Some of her strongest talents.
I think that's right. Those were probably the most challenging for me as well. Thank you for that question. For me, the jury is still out with respect to colorblindness. Race has been a factor in American politics since the founding of America, right? Along with the U.S. Constitution, you have the Three-Fifths Compromise. That same year or earlier the next year, you have the founding of the Black Church, right? Racism, the problem of racism is endemic to American society in many ways. Some scholars will say, though, racism is not about color. It's more about identifying a break within the population at which you point at and say, this is where the species changes, right? Now, that break can happen along a number of different lines. It can be across the line of color, right? It could also be across the line of things like physical capacities, right? It could also be, you see a lot of this in the Holocaust, right? It wasn't just about the annihilation of the Jews. It was also gypsies. It was also Roma, right? All these different populations that were racialized in different ways. So the idea of race can function outside or beyond the category of color. And in fact, some scholars will argue that during slavery, I believe his name is, I want to say is Orlando Patterson at Harvard, argues that during slavery, the real distinction was between color. It was about hair, right? So that if you had good hair, if you were black and you had good hair, you could do what they call pass, right? You could pass because good hair was a sign that you had somehow been integrated into a different kind of race, right? So it's about hair as opposed to skin color, some will argue. This is a tough question for me as a result of these kinds of difficulties. I'll say in the current condition, it looks to be the case that although the majority of people incarcerated are black or Latino, we do have to pay attention to the fact that there are whites also incarcerated, and that there are blacks who seem to be living lives just fine. And so one of my lingering questions is, to what extent does color play a role, or is there something else going on that sort of just slides past color so that you have a good deal of whites as well as a few people of color who are able to escape from the brutality of police force and that kind of thing, is about economics, for example, as opposed to color. These are the kind of questions that still linger with me, but the numbers right now are so staggering with respect to race that I can't help but leave it on the table. Right, so this is something that I struggle with well, and she sort of pushed me on that. I'm still thinking about that. Affirmative action, whenever I read that, I took that as Alexander saying, this was an important issue, we've got a bigger issue now, right? Affirmative action is helpful, but if half of your population is in prison, right, it doesn't really have the same effect if you want to argue for those kinds of things. My personal view is that affirmative action still matters, right? It's these kinds of things still matter because of, right, the dynamics we see like in mass incarceration. I wish he had not drawn such a hard line between the two. I wish he maybe had talked about the ways in which these things are connected to one another. Yeah, I'll say that. Yeah, thank you. That was a great question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
This is a rule in her book, Guidance in Race Resistance, the original person Christians, as perceiving themselves as members of a new ethnic. And I wonder if you can start with such a theological understanding to help us find the answer to the race fact mind. The image of biblical Pentecost of disparate peoples united by common purpose and shared faith, what limits our ability to do much of this restorative and reconciling work in our American time?
Wow. I agree. No, I definitely think that's right. I mean, I was thinking about taking that kind of direction in the lecture. I think that most, well, I can't even say that with confidence. I would hope that most Christians would intuit that kind of thinking, right? That part of the claim of the gospel is that we are called away from almost every other significant kind of relationship we have to allegiance to Christ, right? And so this is, Jesus will say even uncomfortable things about how we're called away from our family, our brothers, that kind of thing. For me, it's kind of a, you just kind of employ deductive reasoning and you end up there, right? If Christ is calling us here, he is calling us away from these other commitments and allegiances. And of course, you'll get all sorts of Christian thinkers who will repeat that or echo something like that. The particular model of Pentecost, I haven't thought about that particular model much, but I think it's a great one. I think especially for the ways in which it highlights the different languages at work as the gospel is being communicated. I think a big problem of ours is that we still can't get beyond these divides of language, culture, tradition, that kind of thing. And so I do think Pentecost offers us some help in that respect. If I were to criticize that metaphor on one point, if I remember the story correctly, once they got the Spirit, they immediately had the languages, right? They were immediately speaking in the tongues of these other people. Well, that may happen if you're Pentecostal, but for the rest of us, it takes a little bit more of a hard work to learn these languages, right? I'm not being facetious. I have Pentecostal roots myself. But we've got to do hard work to learn language, right? We can't, it may not be as quick as a holy fire that comes down that allows us to communicate so easily with those that are different from us. It takes a little bit more, I think, hard work, time, and effort. But I think that's also in the Gospels. Yeah. Maybe that begins to answer your question a little bit. Was there there's a second part to that?
The two parts of it. One, her book basically says that first century Christians actually from the different nations view themselves as something different. Their perception
Oh, I see what you're saying.
is different. And so, in a theological understanding, how does that sort of challenge us about how we so embrace theology that are so disparate today?
Yeah. That claim, I'm not sure about. You know, you'd have to get sort of an antiquity scholar or something like that to verify whether or not they really thought of themselves that way. I think it has a lot of legs theologically. I think that's the kind of thing we need. Some kind of sense of peoplehood that will get us beyond these parochial categories, these non-scientific categories, right, of race and that kind of thing. I mean, they're kind of imaginaries if you get to the bottom of it. We kind of make it up in our minds and we project it onto different groups based on color or based on whatever. And of course, real life experience shows the ways in which these categories and abstractions fall short of reality. So I think that'd be a great path to pursue. Yeah.
I'm going to say thanks to Asante. We have one more? Oh, okay. One more question. Let's move this for our team. Please.
It's very important. Mm. 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 Yeah. Let me answer, well, approach your first one. And remind me again, this was the question, the first question was the one about, remind me again, the first? Religion, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, religion is, it's very important. It's probably one of the most important components of all this, right? Because, this is where, I'm not an outright Marxist, but I think there's maybe something to what he said about the way in which religion can operate, right? If you look throughout history, the Christian church has placed emphasis on different kinds of theological doctrines at certain points in time, right? And so Marx wants to talk about the ways in which these different inflections can at times be function ideologically, right, to legitimate the larger social dynamics. What exactly does that look like? What exactly does theology do? How exactly can it be different? Those are questions I'm still asking, and I'm researching right now. But you're right, religion does play a role. And so you begin to get into questions like, are there particular kinds of doctrines that do certain kinds of work to help make this make sense, right? So that's what I would say to your first question. Religion is a huge legitimacy. So even if religion doesn't have the right words to say, if it begins to critique and speak back, people listen, right? Because of what religion represents. Secondly, how can we help people coming out? This is a challenge. This is probably where I am most weak on because I'm still in terms of diagnosis. I will say that if you look at the big picture, it can seem a bit overwhelming. And so what I would recommend you do first is get involved locally, right? Maybe even at a local school or organization where either your kids or somebody's kids go, right? Where you have some kind of investment and maybe then begin to branch out from there. I think that's probably the best way to begin to address these issues. At a certain point, I'm sure there will be national kinds of issues, but before and after, right? Change doesn't really happen unless there's also local change, local transformation. And I would say one at a time, right? I'll say do one thing at a time. That's probably where I would begin. Yeah. I will also say I've seen several churches do a lot of good things with respect to prison populations. Things like the ministries they have once a person comes out of prison and they need a house to stay and then you get a job, that kind of thing. These are all very helpful. The problem is that the system itself is taking so many bodies into the system, right? Before the church has the resource at the time or the volunteers to help people transition out. And then you get into all sorts of other problems like, well, were people illegally detained or were people detained without have their rights read, that kind of thing. So I think that the church can help, but I also want to be sure to remind you all of the limits of each and every individual local church, right? This is a big problem. And churches are small and they're limited in their capacities to help, so they should do what they can. But I think probably my view is that a deeper, widespread theological change needs to happen. That kind of thing. Yeah.
All right. I could then say thank you to Asante.
Thank you.
And we should all noticed